Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go! I'm a 20-year-old guy working at our country's emergency dispatch center. Where I live, we have one nationwide emergency number that everyone calls for help. After taking the call, we contact firefighters who respond similar to paramedics, though they don't administer medications. My path to this job wasn't exactly straightforward. I'd always been fascinated by emergency services since I was a kid. My uncle was a firefighter, and the stories he told around family dinners captivated me. When I turned 18, I initially tried to become a firefighter myself, but some minor health issues disqualified me. Not willing to give up on my dream of helping people in emergencies, I applied for dispatch training instead. The job is stressful but rewarding. Well, most days. Today was what we call a crap show day. We were severely understaffed, with multiple units already out on calls. The phone lines wouldn't stop ringing and everyone was stretched thin. That's when I got the call from a regular troublemaker. This one individual, let's just call him the caller, is infamous among our dispatch team. He is consistently rude, extraordinarily loud, and almost always intoxicated when he calls. He is known for tying up emergency lines for non-emergency issues, usually because he wants free transportation. The phone rang and I immediately recognized the number. I answered with a standard emergency services greeting asking about his emergency. The caller immediately shouted that he needed a ride to the store right away. His words were slurred, and I could tell he was drunk again. I took a deep breath. I explained to him that this was an emergency line, reminded him that we'd discussed this before, and clarified that we weren't a taxi service. I suggested he call a cab instead, mentioning they would be cheaper than the fine he could get for misusing emergency services. The caller responded angrily, telling me not to tell him what to do and calling me a jerk. I maintained my composure and explained that while we do provide non-emergency medical transport for appointments like physiotherapy, those services need to be scheduled in advance, just like everyone else does. He complained that he didn't have money for a cab and argued that we were supposed to help people. I patiently explained that we do help people, but only in actual emergencies, and his need for a ride to the store didn't qualify as one. The caller's voice grew even louder as he threatened to call emergency services and tell my bosses it was an emergency. I replied that he could do that since he was a free citizen, but warned him that misusing emergency services was a serious offense. He defiantly told me to watch him and hung up. I knew exactly what was coming. Less than 2 minutes later, I received a call from the emergency hotline. The operator told me they needed emergency service at the caller's address for a reported case of alcohol poisoning. I recognized the address immediately and advised the operator that the individual at that address had just called, threatening to fake an emergency. I mentioned his history of aggressive behavior and suggested that the responding team might need additional support. About 50 minutes later, my radio crackled to life. It was one of my colleagues who had responded to the call. He asked me what was going on, wondering why the intervention team was arresting the caller and why there were so many police officers when the call was supposed to be about alcohol poisoning. I was confused too, so I asked for details. Apparently, when the police arrived with our emergency team, the caller had tried to force his way into the driver's seat of the police vehicle, insisting they drive him to his destination. When the officers refused, he became violent and actually punched one of the cops. The intervention team responded with force, subduing him in the process. The caller ended up being hospitalized with several broken bones. He's now facing charges for assaulting a police officer, misuse of emergency services, and public intoxication. The hospital is also treating him for alcohol addiction. What started as a demand for a free ride ended with a hospital stay and criminal charges. The entitlement of some people never ceases to amaze me. He thought his desire for a free ride trumped actual emergencies on a day when we were already overwhelmed. I later found out this wasn't his first run-in with the law, but it was definitely his most serious. I just went back to answering the next call. Another day at dispatch, Another entitled person thinking emergency services exist solely for their convenience. A week later, I was surprised when my supervisor called me into her office. She explained that the police department had sent over the body camera footage from the incident with a caller. Apparently, they wanted to use it for training purposes, and they needed my statement to complete their report. When I watched the footage, I was shocked at just how belligerent the caller had been. On the video, he could be seen stumbling toward the police vehicle, yanking at the door handle, and slurring demands for a ride to the liquor store. When the officer denied his request, the caller took a wild swing that barely connected with the officer's shoulder. What followed was swift and by the book. The intervention team subdued him with textbook precision. My supervisor commended me for handling the initial call professionally and for warning the response team about potential danger. She mentioned that because of my warning, they had sent additional officers, which helped prevent the situation from escalating even further. I later heard that the caller was sentenced to 6 months in a rehabilitation facility as part of his plea deal. Some of my colleagues think he got off easy, but I hope the mandatory treatment helps him turn things around. Regardless, I've saved the recording of that call, not to mock him, but as a reminder of why we take every call seriously and why protocols matter. In emergency services, you never know when a routine call might turn dangerous or when an entitled demand might end with handcuffs and a hospital stay. I spent over 2 years working at a hotel where I got to know everything about how things run, especially when we changed to a new hotel brand. The training was tough and covered everything from helping guests to learning company rules. In the end, only 2 of us still worked there who had gone through that original training. Working at the front desk meant dealing with all types of people. Most guests were pleasant, but occasionally you'd encounter someone who thought their status entitled them to special treatment beyond what our policies allowed. One afternoon I arrived for my 3:11 shift and immediately noticed something was wrong. My 2 morning shift colleagues, both young women who had recently graduated high school, had clearly been crying. Their makeup was smeared all over their faces. Our front desk manager, who had only been with us for about 4 to 6 months, looked absolutely furious. I asked what was wrong. The front desk manager explained that we had a major jerk as a guest who was the highest level on the rewards program for the hotel chain. He described how this guest was constantly demanding free upgrades and freebies and screamed during every interaction with staff. He told me every department had called him complaining about this guest and that just now the man had come to the desk and screamed at my 2 colleagues until they were both crying. I felt terrible for my colleagues. They were sweet, innocent people who genuinely enjoyed helping guests. While my manager was explaining the situation, I looked up the guest's information in our system. As soon as I saw his details, a smile spread across my face. I pointed out to my manager that the guest was actually an employee of a different hotel. My manager acknowledged this but didn't see why it mattered. I explained that when traveling using an employee discount, guests are required to behave respectfully, as stated in the fine print on the discount form. I grabbed the form and showed it to my manager, pointing at specific text. I showed him where it said that failure to be respectful could lead to having an employee discount suspended or permanently revoked, and could even result in termination. I suggested that he call this guest's hotel, ask for the general manager, and explain who he was and what the guest was doing. I quickly looked up the hotel's phone number, called, and handed the phone to my manager. After a lengthy conversation, my manager hung up with an evil, satisfied smile. The manager told me that the guest's general manager was absolutely furious after hearing about everything the guest had done. Just then, our main switchboard phone rang. I answered professionally, greeting the caller and asking how I could direct their call. The caller requested to speak to the entitled guest's room. I politely agreed and transferred the call. After transferring the call, I made a sarcastic comment to my manager about how someone wanted to talk to the entitled jerk, and I wondered who that could be. My manager burst out laughing. He told me that the general manager had given him his personal cell number and instructed him to call immediately if we had any more issues. He said he was leaving the number next to the switchboard in case we needed it. I told my manager that while his revenge was done, mine was just beginning. My manager looked worried and asked what I was planning to do. I smiled mischievously and picked up the phone. I called Hotel Rewards customer service and reported that someone was using a rewards account while also using an employee discount on his stay. The customer service representative exclaimed that this wasn't allowed. I acknowledged this and explained that's why I was calling to report the violation. I provided the guest's reservation number and rewards member information. I suggested to the representative that if they investigated the guest's history, they'd likely find all his stays were booked at employee discount rates. The representative told me they were starting a ticket to investigate the guest's account. I thanked them and hung up. After hanging up, I removed his rewards number from his current stay. My manager was grinning from ear to ear and commented on how awesome that was. I told him that I wasn't quite finished yet, and that it was time to spread the news to all departments that the guest was no longer a rewards member. I made a new key for his room without concierge access. Then I went to every department in the hotel to explain the situation. The reaction was the same everywhere I went. As soon as I mentioned his name, staff members would groan and ask what the jerk had done now. I explained to each department that he was no longer a rewards member, and that if he gave anyone issues, they should call the front desk immediately. I added that his general manager had likely already reprimanded him. Everyone was thrilled with this news. Finally, I went to the concierge room and used the guest's new key to invalidate his current one. I spoke with the evening concierge, who visibly cringed at the mention of his name. I told her she wouldn't have to deal with him anymore and asked her to leave a note for the morning staff that this guest was no longer allowed in the concierge room. Her relief was palpable. When I returned to the front desk, my 2 morning shift colleagues were still there. They rushed over and hugged me, thanking me repeatedly. After they left, the manager pulled me aside. The manager asked me to do him a huge favor. When I asked what he needed, he requested that if he ever made me angry, I would come tell him so he could fix the issue. Later that night, the entitled guest came to the desk humbled and polite, saying his key didn't work. I apologized for the inconvenience and offered to make him a new key, giving him my best fake smile while making a standard room key without any special access. The next day, I checked his rewards account and found it was suspended. When I checked again the following week, I received a message stating the account number could not be found. Serves him right. About 10 years ago, I had some leftover 2.5-inch stainless steel tubing from a metalworking project. Instead of letting it go to waste, I decided to make something useful with it. I constructed a walkway guardrail and, most importantly for this story, some large garden arches with plant shelves for my wife. These weren't your typical garden arches. Being made of stainless steel, they were extremely heavy, about 400 pounds each. Installing them was a serious job that required a forklift. I had to anchor them securely into the ground and position large landscaping stone blocks around them to complete the garden design. They looked fantastic when finished, and my wife loved them. My wife posted some pictures of the arches on Facebook, showing off our garden. That's when the trouble started. One day, my wife mentioned that some woman she didn't know had contacted her about the arches. Apparently, this stranger had seen the photos online and wanted to borrow one for her daughter's wedding. My wife had already explained that they were too large and permanent to move around, but this woman wasn't taking no for an answer. A few days later, this stranger showed up at our house unannounced. Let's call her Wedding Mom for simplicity's sake. When Wedding Mom arrived, she greeted me and immediately asked about borrowing the wedding arch, claiming my wife had told her we had one she could use. I politely explained that the arches weren't portable since they were anchored to the ground and would require a forklift to move. Wedding Mom dismissed my concerns, saying she could simply get someone to pick it up. I tried again to make her understand, explaining that these weren't lightweight decorations. Each arch weighed about 400 pounds, required a forklift for installation, and was secured in concrete. I added that they wouldn't even fit in a pickup truck. She brushed off these practical issues and asked if I could arrange for a forklift to load it for her. By this point, my patience was wearing thin as she clearly wasn't listening to anything I was saying. I explained that what she was asking was impossible. I detailed all the work it would require, cutting the arch from its anchors, moving several 4,000-pound stone blocks just to access it properly, arranging special transportation equipment, and then having to re-weld everything upon its return. I emphasized that these arches were permanent garden fixtures never intended to be moved. Wedding mom became increasingly desperate, insisting that she absolutely needed the arch and claiming her daughter's wedding would be completely ruined without it. When she realized I wouldn't budge on moving the arch, she switched tactics. She then asked if I could at least paint the arch white to match her wedding theme. I explained that the whole point of using stainless steel was that it never needed painting, and that preparing and painting polished stainless was an extremely difficult process that would require sanding, prepping, priming, painting, and then repolishing to remove all the sanding scratches. I gave her a definite no. What followed was a remarkable display of emotional manipulation. Wedding mom cycled through begging, crying, and accusing me of causing permanent emotional damage to her daughter. When none of this worked, she resorted to screaming at me. At this point, my wife intervened. She suggested to wedding mom that if she really wanted an arch like ours, she could have one custom made for about $4,400 and have it painted by professionals elsewhere. Wedding mom reacted with indignation, declaring that she had no intention of paying for an arch and that we were supposed to lend it to her completely free of charge. After more heated arguments, she finally left, and we thought that was it. About 2 weeks later, I received an urgent call from my wife while at work. She explained that wedding mom had returned with reinforcements. She had brought family members, friends, a pickup truck, and even the county sheriff to our home. I rushed back to find chaos in our driveway. Wedding mom had assembled quite a group, and the pickup truck they'd brought was nowhere near large enough for the arch. Most concerning was the presence of our local sheriff's deputy, though, fortunately, I'd known him for about 30 years as he lived just a couple miles down the road. When I approached, I saw wedding mom waving some kind of document while shouting that she had a receipt and the arches belonged to her. Looking closer at her receipt, I could see it was obviously home-printed with no business name, address, or signatures. It falsely claimed she had purchased both arches for merely $200. I explained the situation to the deputy, describing how this woman was attempting to steal our property and that the arches had been in our garden for years. I pointed out that the receipt was clearly fraudulent. Meanwhile, I tried to keep wedding mom's increasingly hostile group at bay. Her supporters became more aggressive, with one family member demanding that we just give her the arch and questioning why we were being so difficult. Another accused us of promising to sell it to her and then backing out of the deal. The deputy spoke with my wife to verify my account. The situation became so heated that he had to call for backup. Eventually, 2 more deputies arrived, and together they escorted wedding mom and her entire group off our property. When they were leaving, wedding mom continued to shout about how I was destroying her daughter's wedding. I never found out how the wedding went, but I can confidently say it wasn't under my wife's arches. There was absolutely no way I was going to move those 4,000-pound stone blocks, tear up my yard, use a cutting torch to remove the arches, transport my forklift from my shop to my home, and then reverse the entire process just to lend these arches to a complete stranger. Interestingly, my wife's Facebook post did inspire some of our actual friends. 2 couples have since had their wedding photos taken under our arches, but the arches stayed exactly where they are, and there were no crazy mother of the brides involved. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.